Hola, buenas tardes. A nombre de la Sociedad Iberoamericana de Estudios Hegelianos, les doy la más cordial bienvenida. Me alegra mucho presentarles a 𝐜𝐴𝑚 Koch, nuestra ponente magistral que cierra el 10º ciclo de charlas Hegel virtual. Sin más, presento a la doctora Koch. 𝐜𝐴𝑚 Koch es investigadora postdoctoral de la Facultad Histórico-Filosófica del Departamento de Arte, Medios y Filosofía de la Universidad de Basilea, en Suiza. Realizó su doctorado en Filosofía en la Universidad Libre de Berlín, donde fue además asistente académica del área de Historia de la Filosofía. Entre sus campos de investigación destacan, en sentido histórico, la filosofía clásica alemana, ante todo Kant, Schelling y Hegel, la fenomenología, en particular la filosofía de Edith Stein, y en sentido sistemático la metafísica, teoría del conocimiento, filosofía de la biología, filosofía feminista. Entre sus numerosas publicaciones destacamos su libro monográfico Denken im Zwecken, Bedeutung und Status der Theologie in der theoretischen Philosophie Kants und Hegel, que ha aparecido en Hegel-Studien en el 2023. Sin más, le damos la más cordial bienvenida a Karen. Karen, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so first of all, thanks very much for the nice introduction, as far as I could understand it. But yeah, thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoy being here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and your questions and comments afterwards. So yeah, there is my talk written in Spanish. I will read the talk in English. And yeah, the title of the talk is Philosophy and the A priori, Reconsidering the Status of Hegel's Logic. So there is an ongoing contemporary discussion whether Hegel's logic is a priori or not. According to proponents of an a priori reading, Hegel's logic is supposed to contain the most fundamental truths of reality that are valid ahistorically, i.e. once and for all, and that are unrevisable in light of experience. Not only with respect to the textual evidence, Hegel almost never uses the a priori, a posteriori distinction, and if he refers to it, he does so in a rather dismissive way, but also and foremost with respect to systematic issues. This reading raises many questions that have led at least a few scholars to doubt it. It raises questions not only about Hegel's philosophical procedure, and that is about the relation of the logic to the Realphilosophie, but also about his conception of philosophy. With respect to the philosophical procedure, the a priori reading seems to imply an idea of Hegel's logic, according to which it presents the self-standing foundation upon which Hegel develops his Realphilosophie. Since in his Realphilosophie, Hegel takes up the scientific results of his time and discloses the conceptual structure of these results, this idea evokes a further one that Hegel tries to subsume these results under the a priori structure given in the logic. Along these lines, one might think that Hegel only applies the a priori logical conceptual structure given in the logic to his Realphilosophie. However, as Thomas Korana recently noted, Hegel's conception of his own philosophy as a circle of circles suggests a different reading. One can well think of the science of logic as the first science, but likewise is it plausible to think of it as a last science, as there is no unidirectional line going from the logic to the Realphilosophie, but rather a mutual interdependency between these different disciplines. The idea of the logic as foundation is thus misleading. With respect to Hegel's conception of philosophy, it is striking that the conception of philosophy as a priori, as revealing the most fundamental a priori truths, is in tension with his very definition of philosophy. Philosophy is its time apprehended in thoughts. It is at least hard to see how, or in which sense, philosophy can be its own time in thoughts by relying on ahistorical structures in order to unfold the structure of reality. For philosophy's own time in thoughts is, to be sure, a historically situated time, i.e. a time structured through a specific historical context and influenced by ideas specific to this context. A priori philosophy does not seem able to capture specific historical context. The reasons that speak against an a priori reading of the logic are, in my view, indeed compelling. There is, however, an intuition that guides proponents of the a priori reading that we should live up to, even if we reject that very reading. This is the intuition that philosophical knowledge is knowledge sui generis. That is, that it is as such distinct from empirical knowledge. In fact, the a priori, a posteriori distinction provides a good basis upon which philosophers could elaborate on this claim, on the claim that philosophical knowledge is a priori, is sui generis knowledge. So once we give up this distinction, the worry is that it is not that clear anymore how or in what way we can still hold on to the claim that philosophical knowledge is a knowledge sui generis. This is the challenge I would like to address in this essay or in this talk. On the one hand, I will argue that Hegel does not engage in a priori philosophy, because, as I said, I think the reasons that speak against such a reading of Hegel's logic as a priori are compelling. On the other hand, I argue that this nevertheless does not commit Hegel to deny that philosophical knowledge is knowledge sui generis. Indeed, Hegel affirms that philosophical knowledge is knowledge sui generis and as such, so to say, different from empirical knowledge. I will proceed as follows. I will first discuss a main feature of the term a priori and show in what sense it provides an excellent basis for the claim that philosophical knowledge is knowledge sui generis. I will do so by drawing on Kant's conception of the a priori. Next, I will turn to Hegel's conception of philosophy. In particular, I will draw on Hegel's definition of philosophy as thinking over, nachdenken in German. Here, I will elaborate on two features of thinking over, namely its belatedness and its form, and discuss their relation to the conception of the a priori. Finally, I will argue for the sui generis character of philosophical knowledge in Hegel. So now I turn to the first part of my talk, to the a priori, and so to say to the Kantian background of these discussions, whether Hegel's logic is a priori or not. So first part. In order to properly discuss the a priori terminology, it is worth to turn to the philosopher who famously introduced the a priori a posteriori distinction, and whose theory also forms the background to the recent discussion of Hegel's relation to the a priori philosophy, Kant. Note, however, that proponents of a priori readings of Hegel's philosophy, and in particular of his logic, do not hold that Hegel simply adopts a Kantian account. In contrast, it has often been pointed out that Hegel rejects the merely subjective origin of the Kantian a priori, and thus the strong kind of dualism that comes along with it. A priori readings of Hegel do not doubt that. They aim to hold to the a priori without also committing to its subjective character in Kant. In giving up the thing in itself and appearance distinction inherent to Kant's a priori philosophy, for instance. The feature, however, that they hold on to and that therefore shall ensure the a priori character of Hegel's philosophy is that a priori cognitions are cognitions that are valid independent from experience. In fact, one of the most prominent definitions of the a priori that Kant gives is to call such a cognition a priori that is, quote, independent of all experience, end of quote. As experience being composed of intuitions and their conceptualizations. I will thus draw on this feature of the a priori in Kant's theory. Kant contrasts this kind of cognition with cognition a posteriori, i.e. cognition that is, as Kant calls it, quote, merely borrowed from experience, end of quote, and as such not independent from it. Now, it is important to note that in characterizing cognition a priori as cognition independent of experience, Kant does not refer to cognition that could somehow be gained by subjects before they actually enter the realm of experience, as opposed to cognition that could be gained only within the realm of experience. In contrast, subjects gain each kind of cognition, a posteriori and a priori cognition, within the realm of experience. A priori cognition does not even imply that we do not need experience at all in order to gain such a cognition. In fact, Kant stresses the importance of experience for both kinds of cognitions. And that's now a long quote, but I think it's worth quoting it. So Kant says, there is no doubt whatever that all our cognition begins with experience. For how else should the cognitive faculty be awakened into its exercise, if not through objects that stimulate our senses and in part themselves produce representations, in part bring the activity of our understanding into motion to compare these, to connect or separate them, and thus to work up the raw material of sensible impressions into a cognition of objects that is called experience. As far as time is concerned, then, no cognition in us precedes experience, and with experience, every cognition begins. End of quote. Kant thus states that only experience sets our cognitive capacities in motion. And setting our cognitive capacities in motion is a necessary condition for gaining cognition, whatever kind of cognition it is. In this sense, experience is a necessary condition also for a priori cognition. The distinction between cognition a priori and cognition a posteriori rather concerns the role of intuition in justifying this very cognition. Whereas a posteriori cognition is verified or falsified by intuition, a priori cognition cannot be verified or falsified by intuition. It is in this sense cognition that is independent of experience. It is helpful to put this distinction in terms of the Genesis validity distinction. While we do need experience in order to gain cognition at all, that is, for the genesis of cognition, a priori cognition applies independently of experience. Thus, according to this distinction, Kant differentiates cognition that is empirically falsifiable from cognition that is valid independently of experience and hence non-falsifiable. According to Kant, philosophical cognition is a priori cognition par excellence. This terminology gives indeed a clear-cut distinction between philosophical knowledge and empirical knowledge. And I think it is this clear-cut distinction that proponents of an a priori reading of Hegel's philosophy would like to hold on to. In order to develop my claim, according to which Hegel does not subscribe to the a priori, but nevertheless holds philosophical knowledge, and that is conceptual knowledge or knowledge about the meaning of concepts, to be knowledge sui generis, I've turned first to two main features of Hegel's conception of philosophy. And now the second part of my talk and the first feature of Hegel's conception of philosophy, which I call the belatedness of Nachdenken. In his introduction to the Encyclopedia, Hegel characterizes philosophy as, quote, thinking consideration, denkende Betrachtung of objects, end of quote, and specifies this thinking consideration as thinking over, nachdenken, in the same paragraph. As for instance, Sebastian Rand and Thomas Korana note, thinking over does not convey some sort of precedence, Vorgängigkeit, but in contrast implies some sort of belatedness. In other words, thinking over is not prior to an experience, but always comes after it. Think, for example, of a philosophical puzzle you would like to solve. You must already be familiar with the puzzle, at least to a certain extent, in order to think it over. Or think of a situation in which you reacted in a way that surprised you. Say you got very angry or even furious and shouted at the other person involved in the specific situation, whereas you usually tend to be rather shy and a reserved person. This experience would, in most cases, also lead you to think your reaction over in order to try to find the reason why you reacted in such an unusual way. Along these lines, thinking over relies on certain experiences that we have already made and that we try to understand. This is consistent with Hegel's claim, also put forward at the beginning of the Encyclopedia. There, he claims not only that, quote, philosophy can, of course, presuppose some familiarity with its objects, end of quote, but also that philosophy, quote, in fact must presuppose this, end of quote. There must be an object understood in a broad sense, to which philosophy, understood as the activity of thinking over, can refer. Scholars, rejecting a reading of Hegel's philosophy as a priori, often take this characterization of philosophical activity, the belatedness, as an indicator that Hegel's philosophy cannot be a priori. Korana, for example, argues that thinking over does not convey, quote, the aspiration of laying down first principles before we have even started with the business of thinking anything concretely, end of quote. Korana uses this argument to argue against the unidirectional line of Hegel's philosophy that an a priori reading would suggest. If we take Hegel's logic to be a priori in the sense that we first think through and lay bare the conceptual determinations of reality before really engaging in cognizing in the realm of experience, then this argument might work. Note, however, that this harbors the danger of building a straw man. It is not clear which philosopher would even understand the a priori along these lines. Even for Kant, the a priori philosopher par excellence, this is not the way a priori philosophy works. The philosophizing subject is always already in the realm of experience, and of course she thinks things concretely and does already have experiences, even when laying down first principles of experience. As we have seen, according to Kant, she even needs to do so in order to set her cognitive capacities in motion. In fact, everything laid out so far about the activity of philosophy as thinking over and about philosophy's familiarity with its objects does not, in any sense, contradict the Kantian conception of philosophy as knowledge a priori. It is not even in tension with it. In other words, nothing speaks against a reading according to which we can understand Hegel's claim about the familiarity of philosophy as simply describing the genesis of philosophical knowledge, or the coming to be of philosophical knowledge. Along these lines, we can take Hegel to argue that philosophy must presuppose familiarity with its objects, because in order of time, we must first gain some representations that we then think over. Spelled out like this, philosophy's belatedness does not contradict an a priori reading of philosophy. This clarifies that if we are to deny that Hegel's philosophy is a priori, we must argue against the validity thesis. That is, against the thesis that there is philosophical knowledge justified independently of experience. The belatedness of philosophy is therefore not to be understood in a temporal way, but in a way that concerns the content of concepts itself. The content of concepts, not even of the concepts of the logic, is not prior to experience. That's my claim. We must thus argue that, with respect to the conceptual knowledge, Hegel does not leave the genesis validity distinction intact. At this point, the proponents of a priori readings of Hegel's philosophy would very probably hold back. For if we reject the validity thesis, it seems that we are committed to claim that philosophical knowledge is only some sort of knowledge a posteriori. I think it is true that Hegel does not share the a priori, a posteriori distinction precisely in the sense of the claim to validity it implies. I do not think, however, that this commits Hegel to hold that philosophical knowledge is only knowledge a posteriori. In order to argue for this, I will draw again on Hegel's characterization of philosophy as thinking over, but on another feature of it, on the peculiar form Hegel ascribes to philosophy as thinking over. And now I'm turning to the third part of my talk, philosophy as thinking consideration, the form of nothing. Starting point of Hegel's introduction of philosophy as thinking over in the Encyclopedia is his reference to the, so to say, unspectacular origin of the activity of philosophy. Philosophy, Hegel claims, is nothing special compared to ordinary experience, insofar as thinking is also what we do in ordinary experience, and in the acquisition of empirical knowledge in general. According to Hegel, thinking is peculiar to human beings. The activity of thinking is for Hegel a distinguishing feature of human beings from animals. Thinking is, however, not peculiar to only philosophizing human beings, but to all humans. This is also true for thinking over. Thinking over is also an activity not only of philosophizing humans, but of all humans. However, Hegel also uses thinking over terminologically. He uses it to determine the activity of philosophy, and what differentiates ordinary thinking from philosophical thinking is the form in which this thinking takes place. In ordinary thinking, the form of the content of thought are representations. In philosophical thinking, the form of the content of thoughts are thoughts or concepts. To take an example, Hegel uses himself in this very paragraph. The sentence, "This leaf is green," is an empirical one. It refers to an object given in experience and is verified or falsified by experience. According to Hegel, here are concepts mixed with representations. In this case, amongst others, they are mixed with a color sensation, the sensation of a thing as green. Now, to think the sentence over means to think about the concepts that are involved in the sentence. In this case, it means to think about the meaning of the concept of singularity, because this in the empirical sentence above implies the concept of singularity. Likewise, it means to think about the concept of being, because is implies the concept of being. And it means to think about the concept of color, as green implies the concept of color. The task of philosophy is firstly to identify these concepts and to secondly disclose their meanings. The latter task demands to uncover the conceptual relations among concepts. To draw on the example above, to show how the concept of singularity connects to the one of universality, for example, and to the one of particularity, and furthermore, how this relates to the concept of being and to the concept of color. It is in this sense that philosophy as thinking over quote, has thoughts, and one might add here concepts, as such as its content, end of quote. And it is in this sense that thinking over is, according to Hegel, the principle of philosophy. The task of philosophy is then to disclose the conceptual structure of experience and to identify the conceptual relations and therefore what Hegel calls content of these concepts. That is their meaning, that according to Hegel structures reality. Again, so far, however, nothing, as one might object, speaks against the idea that this structure is nevertheless a priori, in the sense that the content of objects, at least the content of the concepts of Hegel's logic, and their inferential relations are not dependent on experience, but represent rather some form of eternal truth. So this could still be true, this claim. This latter claim, however, and this is the argument I would like to put forward here to argue against this objection, is exactly what Hegel must deny. He must deny this because for Hegel, the concepts of the logic do not have another content as reality itself. I will draw on the following quote to unpack this claim, and this is also a quite longer quote. It is important that philosophy should be quite clear about the fact that its content is nothing other than the basic import that is originally produced and produces itself in the domain of the living spirit. The content that is made into the world, the outer and inner world of consciousness. In other words, the content of philosophy is actuality. The first consciousness of this content is called experience, end of quote. Hegel explicitly claims that the conceptual determinations have the same content as the realm of experience. It is helpful to compare this claim to Kant's claim about the relation of the categories to the realm of experience in order to disclose the implications of Hegel's claim. For Kant, too, the categories refer to reality, i.e. to the realm of experience, and only to this realm. Also, according to Kant, the realm of experience is structured through concepts, the categories. The distinguishing moment is, however, that in Kant's philosophical theory, originally, the categories do not have the same content as this very realm. The categories originating in the subject do have nothing in common with the intuitions of the empirical manifold given by sensibility. This is what makes the transcendental deduction necessary in the first place, to show that the categories apply to the empirical manifold. Originally, there is thus a gap, and in this sense, a dualism between concepts and intuitions of the empirical manifold. Hegel is very clear in rejecting this thesis as the very starting point of a philosophical theory. According to Hegel, there is no gap, no strong dualism between concepts and the empirical realm, understood as a stuff that is given through sensibility. Concepts structure the reality of experience directly in that they do not have the same content as the realm of experience, the same content as the realm of experience. Hegel is therefore in no need of a transcendental deduction. If the conceptual determinations do have the same content as reality, however, it seems to be not only the case that the conceptual determinations of the logic structure reality in a direct way, but also that developments or processes in reality must be capable, at least in principle, to affect and challenge the meaning of the conceptual determinations in the logic. For insofar as the basic import has been originally produced and is still produced in the realm of experience, it must affect the content of the logic, if it is supposed to be the same content. I think it is in this vein that Hegel claims in his philosophy of absolute spirit that philosophy is, quote, the logical with the meaning that it is a universality proven in its reality, end of quote. The conceptual determinations of the logic are proven in reality, and they must prove themselves in reality, in the realm of experience, again and again. It follows that the content of these concepts must be altered if they are not proven in reality. There must therefore be a complex interdependency between the logic and reality. To be sure, there's a lot more to say about how these meanings get altered and when. How this interdependency is to be spelled out exactly is, however, another question that I cannot address in this paper. Note, however, that my view does not imply that there is nothing stable in Hegel's logic anymore. My view just implies that the alterability of the logic. To sum up, unlike the Kantian account, where we do need the realm of experience only in order to set up our cognitive capacities in motion and to gain experience, from which we can then abstract and identify the fundamental principles through which this realm of experience is structured, in Hegel, we not only need the realm of experience for the genesis of philosophical cognition, but also for proving its validity. I think the advantages of such a reading are clear. It opens up the possibility to alter conceptual structures that belong to outdated scientific results and regressive political views, due to stereotypes within a Hegelian framework. This reading, however, makes it urgent to discuss the sui generis status of philosophy, since the proponents of an a priori reading might fear that Hegel's philosophy would collapse into knowledge a posteriori. As I claimed in the introduction, I hold that a reading of Hegel's logic that denies that it has an a priori character is not committed to this claim. The next section therefore addresses the following question. Why is philosophy, and in particular Hegel's logic, not simply complex knowledge a posteriori if we deny it having an a priori status? And this is now the fourth part of my talk. In order to discuss this question and to determine in which sense Hegel's logic would run the danger of being a posteriori, I would like to introduce a perhaps rather unusual difference. The difference between empirical knowledge and conceptual knowledge a posteriori, each representing a specific type of knowledge a posteriori. Against the background of the last parts of this paper, talk, empirical knowledge is knowledge of representations. It is conceptual knowledge, but mixed with intuitions, sensations, and feelings. It is clear that philosophical knowledge is not this kind of knowledge for Hegel, since philosophical knowledge is knowledge about conceptual determinations and their meanings. Both readings, a prioristic readings and non-a prioristic readings of Hegel's logic, would hold that. If knowledge a posteriori is synonymous to empirical knowledge, as it is the case in Kant, then Hegel's logic cannot be knowledge a posteriori. However, proponents of an a priori reading would most probably understand knowledge a posteriori in a different way. They would understand knowledge a posteriori in principle as knowledge whose validity is proven through experience. Against the background of my reading of the status of concepts in Hegel's philosophy, this status of the concepts would then be knowledge a posteriori in this sense. Thus, even if it is conceptual knowledge or knowledge of pure concepts, it would be called knowledge a posteriori insofar as this knowledge is knowledge of concepts that were and are already realized in reality and whose content originates from there. Would it make sense to call Hegel's logic a posteriori in this sense? I think it would not. To claim that Hegel's logic is not a priori does not mean to claim that it is a posteriori, but it means to abandon the whole distinction. If Hegel does not think that there is such a thing as knowledge a priori, then it does not make any sense to call his philosophy a posteriori. A comparison to other cases might help to make this more plausible. If we do not believe in the distinction between male and female, it does not make sense to call all people female. Instead, we should get rid of the distinction altogether. If we, however, want to hold on to this distinction, I think we are rather committed to claim that there are moments a posteriori and moments a priori within Hegel's philosophy. Insofar as conceptual determinations have to be proven in reality, we could call them a posteriori. Insofar as conceptual determinations themselves, however, structure reality, we could call them a priori. It follows, however, that the distinction cannot serve anymore as clear-cut basis for philosophical and non-philosophical knowledge, which was the initial aim of proponents of a priori readings of Hegel's philosophy. This discussion reveals that the question if Hegel's philosophy presents knowledge a priori or a posteriori is in fact misleading. Consequently, the sui generis status of philosophical knowledge, which also Hegel affirms, must be conceptualized in a different way. And I think two promising candidates are two main features that Hegel attributes to philosophical knowledge: the specific character of systematicity of philosophical knowledge and the high degree of reflexivity of philosophical knowledge. Let's dwell on the systematic character first. Hegel is explicit that philosophy thinks conceptual determinations over in such a way that philosophy identifies its inferential connections. Philosophy connects conceptual determinations in a systematic way. To connect conceptual determinations systematically does not only mean to connect these determinations inherently, that is, with respect to their conceptual meaning, but it does also mean to identify these determinations as moments of a conceptual whole. These two features, as Hegel explicitly states, distinguishes philosophical knowledge from knowledge of empirical science. Now, also in empirical science, knowledge is to be systematized, in that empirical science finds, for instance, laws to natural processes and kinds of individual organisms, or to put it more generally, universal determinations of empirical things. Coming back to the example given above, empirical science do identify a specific leaf and determine it as a leaf of a certain species and of a certain kind or genus. In contrast to philosophy, empirical science, however, do not ask how the concept of singularity relates to the concept of universality. Neither do they ask how the concept of singularity relates to other conceptual determinations of other empirical science. According to Hegel, philosophy, however, connects conceptual determinations of one empirical science to other ones. His own philosophy serves as greatest sample. Hegel collects scientific results of empirical science and presents the systematic connections of the conceptual determination implied in these results. There is, for instance, an inherent connection between his philosophy of nature and his philosophy of subjective spirit and his philosophy of objective spirit. Within Hegel's philosophy, questions such as the relationship between the concept of the state and the concept of life, or the concept of mechanism, are not surprising and make indeed sense. Thus, in contrast to empirical science, the systematic character of philosophy can be characterized as a meta-systematic character. The systematicity at stake is not to establish connections of concepts in order to give knowledge a systematic scientific form, but rather to interconnect concepts that have already been systematized by each empirical science singularly, in order to form a system of sciences. What also characterizes philosophy in a crucial way is that these systematizations always already take place at a cognitive meta level. Philosophy relates to concepts through scientific results in such a way that the thinking of these concepts already involves the thinking of these concepts. The philosophical thinking of X also implies the process of the very thinking of X. That means philosophy thinks the conceptual determinations of reality in such a way that philosophizing subjects co-reflect their own standpoint as cognizing subjects, which itself is part of these conceptual determinations. In the logic, the idea of cognition and the absolute idea are to fulfill this task. In Hegel's Realphilosophie, the psychology section in the philosophy of subjective spirit reflects this cognizing process. According to the demands of such a high level of reflexivity, even the concept of philosophy as this meta-reflective structure needs to be thematized in philosophical thinking. And this is what happens in the section on philosophy of absolute spirit. It is in particular this section that one might be inclined to read passages as indicating an a priori account of philosophical knowledge. Hegel's conception of philosophy as spelled out in absolute spirit might allude to such a reading as Hegel there claims that philosophy is only the idea thinking itself. The idea thinking itself is a quote. And Hegel claims this thinking to be self-sufficient. This might point to a reading according to which philosophical knowledge is somewhat independent from the empirical realm and does not need this very realm for proving the validity of its thinking, because it's self-sufficient. However, against the background of my argument, another reading is at least as plausible as the a priori reading. In the section on philosophy of absolute spirit, Hegel refers to the philosophical thinking over that had happened in the philosophy of nature and in the philosophy of spirit. As Hegel claims, quote, this movement, which is philosophy, finds itself already accomplished, in that it grasps its own concept at the end, i.e., looks back only on its knowledge. End of quote. Philosophy, as it is presented in absolute spirit, then thematizes this philosophical grasping of the conceptual structures of reality and thus the philosophical practice itself. Accordingly, in absolute spirit, the philosophizing subject thinks the conceptual determinations in relation to each other, whose own manifestation she herself is, since she is part of these conceptual structures that she always already thinks implicitly in experience and explicitly in philosophy. Philosophy, thus, is the idea thinking itself because philosophy reflects its own concept. For such a kind of reflection, no reference to the empirical realm is needed. And I think that is why Hegel attributes self-sufficiency to philosophy in absolute spirit. But such a kind of reflection is only possible once philosophizing subjects have reflected upon the conceptual structures they have discovered. From this point of view, Hegel asks philosophers to reflect the meaning of the crucial concepts structuring reality as pure concepts, and in the historical context, that would be then the Realphilosophie. Likewise, he thinks philosophy demands from us to reflect our own thinking of these concepts in and without the historical context. Thus, in Realphilosophie, which would be in the historical context, and in logic, which would be without the historical context. Before I conclude, I would like to turn to one objection that one might raise immediately with respect to my reading. Hegel insists on the unconditional nature, Voraussetzungslosigkeit, of his philosophy, and in particular of the logic. His logic, pure thoughts, are not supposed to rely on anything but on the conceptual development of concept determinations. With respect to my reading, one might worry that the logic is not without presuppositions anymore, but that it has history and the development of concepts in history as its very condition. However, I think it is still coherent to claim that Hegel's logic is presuppositionless and self-contained in its meta-systematic and meta-reflexive character, but relies on the empirical realm and historical context in the production of concepts. We do not need to refer to empirical sciences or to a historical context, but only to the content, to the meaning of the concept itself, in order to think the logic. Philosophy is thus detached from the empirical realm because of this kind of meta-systematicity and meta-reflexivity. And yet, such a reflection of concepts requires a reflection on how concepts are produced and thus on the historical situatedness of knowledge. If this is correct, then Hegel's conception of philosophy demands from us to a great extent to reflect our own standpoint as historically situated and not to abstract from it, and to reach out for eternal truths that are valid once and for all. To the latter endeavor, to search for eternal truths, Hegel has only the following to say, and that is the last quote: "It is just as foolish to fancy that any philosopher can transcend its present world as that an individual could leap out of his time and jump over the Rhodes. If a theory transgresses its time and builds up a world as it ought to be, it has an existence merely in the unstable element of opinion, which gives room to every wandering fancy." End of quote and end of talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen, for this amazing talk. I will translate just what I've just said, and then I will ask if someone has any questions, and I will translate it for you. Okay. Bueno, le acabo de agradecer a Karen Koch por su excelente presentación. Abrimos el foro para las preguntas. Si alguien desea formularlas en inglés, adelante. Yo traduciré los elementos clave de la pregunta. Si alguien, para el público, y si alguien quiere plantearla en inglés, la traduciré de la mejor manera posible para Karen. Y así, de igual manera, con las respuestas. Así que, adelante. Me parece que en la plataforma de Facebook podríamos revisar si hay alguna pregunta o comentario. Y si no, me gustaría iniciar yo misma la ronda, pero me parece que sí hay un comentario. ¿O no es el comentario de Pedro? I think there are no questions yet. I will take advantage of the situation to ask some questions that I have myself, and I will be, of course, aware of the platform to see if someone wants to ask something. So, okay, thank you again for the talk, for the ideas you propose. In general terms, I think I totally agree with, well, totally in brackets, agree with you. I agree with you. Let's put it this way. I agree with you in the general lines. But I have, it's a personal struggle concerning how to read Hegel in the light of Kant's transcendental project. So as far as I can see, you're trying to detach, so to say, or at least the consequence of your work is to say that Hegel is it's not a Kantian, so to say. If we stay, if we stick to the line of your argument, that will be a conclusion. Of course, we can also talk about different other problematics, but in this particular problem, we could conclude that Hegel is not a Kantian. This is something I'm tempted to agree with, but on the other hand, I cannot disregard the fact that German idealism, classical German philosophy in this particular generation, I mean Schelling and Hegel, are profoundly, they have a big depth towards transcendental philosophy. And one of these steps is manifested in this famous letter Schelling wrote to Hegel, where Schelling says, you know what letter I'm referring to, like, Kant gave us the conclusions and we need to find the premises. And I think those premises are what the transcendental meant for Kant and for Schelling and Hegel as well. And I think this transcendental is what we can understand as an a priori as well. So my commentary starts with this question. So should we limit ourselves to understand the a priori? In this particular sense, you've just defined, as opposed to the a posteriori, or should we also take into account this other non-defined meaning of a priori in Kant's account of the transcendental? Let me put it another way. I would agree with you on the fact that Hegel is not defining philosophy as an a priori knowledge if we define a priori only as opposed to a posteriori. But what about this other meaning that, according to Schelling, Kant never really explained? So what about this other meaning of the transcendental, of the knowledge a priori, as the knowledge of the conditions of knowledge? Would you also think that Hegel is also against this understanding of the a priori?
Yeah, good question.
Oh, hold on. I need to translate myself. This is acabo de voy a resumir un poco lo que he preguntado. Mi pregunta tiene que ver con dos posibles significados del concepto de a priori, con el concepto que Karen ha definido como opuesto a posteriori, pero también con la definición, o más bien no definición, de una segunda de un posible significado de lo a priori, como esta dimensión propia de lo trascendental, en donde es posible conocer las condiciones de conocimiento. Y esta pregunta tiene otra pregunta implícita, a saber si rechazando este vínculo se asumiría, se rompería de manera, digamos, radical con la idea de que Hegel es un deudor de la filosofía kantiana.
Yeah, yes. Thank you very much. Okay, good question. I mean, like, so in one way, what I think first, what really is striking is that Hegel never, as I said at the beginning of my talk, never uses the a priori to describe his own philosophy and to characterize his own philosophy. And I think this is just a superficial statement or superficial observation, but I think it's important because you can see it quite easily. And if you go to the Science of Logic PDF, you will see that there are like a priori is mentioned like really rarely, and often in a negative way or dismissive way. So coming against this background, it's striking that a lot of scholars call Hegel's logic a priori. And then it is true, though, that in Kant, the a priori has different meanings. And now I only worked with two. Like in the first part of my talk, I just said that scholars that would say that the logic is a priori, they don't want to say that it's subjective. Because in Kant, the a priori refers to such a not subjective origin. And this would be one meaning, and I didn't work with this any further because I think, yeah, those scholars, that they reject this immediately, the subjectivity, the subjective hinge of Kant's philosophy. But then coming to that's why I came to the other distinction of or thought about the other distinction about the a priori and the posteriori, but then that has also something to do with the validity of philosophical knowledge. And now I understood you in this sense that you're asking for a third meaning, right, of the a priori, and this would be like the search for the conditions of knowledge, to lay bare the conditions of knowledge and so on. And if Hegel wouldn't agree to such an endeavor. And well, I always then think of the swimming argument. So, I mean, yeah, because like the swimming argument goes like saying that one cannot learn to swim if one only learns it in theory but doesn't jump into the water. You need to have both. So in this sense, one could say, well, yes, even if we say that Hegel's logic is a disclosing of conceptual structures which might also or does involve the structures that are constitutive for us and conditions us, it can't happen in such a way that we are not already in this very consideration, so to say. So like we can't only do it on a theoretical basis, but we just have to jump in, so to say, to come back to the swimming argument. So in this sense, I would say that that for Kant, laying bare the conditions of knowledge in order to justify what true knowledge is, this seems to be a wrong way for Hegel. So we can only justify correct true knowledge through going through the whole process and also doing a lot of mistakes and so on in order to achieve the true knowledge. So also in this sense, I would say there is a difference, even though I agree with you that of course, like for a talk and for making the claim as explicit as it can be, it's sometimes good to make it like provocative in this sense. But I still would say I wouldn't call it a priori, even though I would agree there are some features in the a priori that also reappear in Hegel. But I think we would do good in not calling them a priori because of the whole things that come along with it in Kant.
I'm going to try to translate and to resume a little bit what you just answered. Para quienes no hayan seguido de manera tan cercana lo que Karen acaba de responder, en términos generales, precisa que hizo una distinción entre dos significados de a priori. El primero sería el que le atribuye un aspecto eminentemente subjetivo al conocimiento, y el segundo es el que se distingue de lo a posteriori. Mi pregunta sugiere para ella que hay un tercer significado de lo a priori, pero sugiere también que quizá no deberíamos llamarlo de esa manera, y aunque está esa cuestión en Kant, es en Hegel, parecería que ahí sí estaría dispuesta a admitir un vínculo, pero bueno, Kant no lo ha desarrollado. Sí. Perdón por lo resumido de la respuesta. Let me check if there are other questions. Otherwise, I would like to discuss this further. Hold on. I will have to postpone my comments. There are two questions. The first is from Javier Aranda, and the second one is Christian 𝐜𝐴𝐿. I will. Both are in English, so I don't need to translate them. I will have to translate just what I've just said. Hay ahora dos preguntas del público que voy a leer. Las preguntas están en inglés y las traduciré de manera resumida. La primera pregunta de Javier Aranda dice: Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Perhaps a good point of comparison would be the notion of immediacy versus the notion of a priori, as in immediacy is not necessarily understood a priori. Okay, that's the first question. I would translate it. Gracias por la magnífica presentación. Tal vez un buen punto de comparación sería la noción de inmediatez versus la noción de lo a priori, en la medida en que la inmediatez no es necesariamente comprendida como lo a priori. The second question, la segunda pregunta de Christian 𝐜𝐴𝐿, no sé si lo pronuncio bien, es la siguiente. Isn't Hegel very clear and aware of this distinction, considering that he knew Kant very well, and what he does is to sublimate this distinction, saying that the a priori is only known as a posteriori. After one reads sorry, it's too small for me.
Okay.
Let me, if you need it to start again the question.
No, I can see it as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, then I will just end this. Sublimate this distinction, saying that the a priori is only known a posteriori after one reads the system. Hence, it is neither but a speculative conclusion, which means it's a sublated conclusion, like all of his other dualities, like spirit and bone, particular and universal, etc. I think it will be difficult to claim Hegel is a posteriori or a posteriori philosopher. Traduciendo rápidamente, Christian afirma que, pregunta si no es demasiado claro que Hegel tiene muy clara a su vez la distinción kantiana, y lo que él mismo responde es que de alguna manera Hegel sublima esta distinción, diciendo que lo a priori solo es conocido a posteriori después de que uno lee el sistema. Por tanto, no es una conclusión especulativa, lo que significa que es una conclusión subsumida, como todas las dualidades con las que trabaja, como espíritu y hueso, particular, universal, etc. Pienso, dice Christian, que sería difícil afirmar que Hegel es un a posteriori, a priori, un filósofo que trabaja con esa dualidad. So, would you like to answer this?
Yes. So I start with now the last question, because this one is now more present to me. So thanks a lot, Christian, for this question or comment. And so I would say that if you mean that, or like how I understand it, is that the distinction between a priori and a posteriori is a distinction that Hegel takes up in his system, but shows how the but then he shows how the a priori is in fact only known a posteriori, like after we went through all of this, and then at the end we know the a priori posteriori. That's how I read the comment. I hope I read it correctly. If not, please write another comment saying I misunderstood you. Because then I would say, but then we would hold on to the distinction between a priori and a posteriori, right? Because then you would first start with the a priori, and then at the end of the whole system, thank you. And then at the end of the whole system, you would realize that. So, okay, no, two questions. Sorry, this was now a little bit confusing. So if you start first, say it's a priori, and then you end at the system and you know the a priori a posteriori, does this then mean that the a priori transforms into knowledge a posteriori, or is only the act of knowing the a posteriori act? So sorry to ask a question back, but this I would like to hear more there in this respect.
Can you hold on? Let me translate what you just said.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Karen contesta reformulando la pregunta para precisar qué tipo de conocimiento sería el conocimiento a posteriori que se tiene de lo a priori. O si, no sé si he entendido bien, I don't know if I understood you correctly at the beginning of your rephrasing. If the a priori is already a knowledge that is known a posteriori as a second kind of knowledge. Is that your rephrasing of the question?
Yes, or if only the process of knowing, if the process of knowing itself renders the a priori knowledge a posteriori. If this is the idea.
Si la idea de la pregunta es en qué momento el conocimiento a priori se vuelve realmente conocimiento, me parece que esa es la reformulación de la pregunta de Cristian. And Christian has...
Yes, he has a few comments in there.
Yeah. So your rephrasing is correct? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Go on.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So thanks. But I mean, there is, I think I need to look, I don't know the paragraph by heart, but I think it's in his Philosophy of Nature, where Hegel refers to the a priori, like he uses the notion a priori in order to characterize some kind of natural scientific thinking where they haven't found like what lies behind a specific experience, and so they call it something a priori that is responsible for this experience, or that caused this in a specific way. I need to look up the paragraph again, but there Hegel would say, well, they just put something as being valid a priori because actually they didn't find, they haven't found the real cause of what happens there empirically. And so they just invented this a priori. So in this sense, this is a really polemic against the a priori. And like this is always in my mind so strongly. And then if we take this polemic seriously, then we can't read the logic in such a way, because this would render the whole logic as just like a fantasy or something like this.
Sorry, I will translate what you just said.
Yeah.
Karen hace referencia a un parágrafo que cree que está en la Filosofía de la Naturaleza, en donde Hegel utiliza el concepto de lo a priori de manera polémica, porque afirma que ese concepto es utilizado solo cuando cuando no se puede remontar a las causas, ¿no? Cuando no se puede ofrecer una causa de los eventos ocurridos. Y esa apelación a lo a priori es a posteriori, pero como una especie de defecto de uso instrumental, por así decirlo, del concepto de lo a priori, cuando no hay una causa que pueda explicar de manera científica los eventos. Y eso es algo que Karen tiene en mente permanentemente cuando piensa en el concepto de lo a priori y la relación que Hegel tiene con él. So, yes.
Yeah, so in this sense, I would say Hegel he doesn't use those terminology in such a way, or as I said, if we take this seriously, then if you like, Christian, then send me an email and I will look up the paragraph I have in mind, because I can't, I don't know it by heart right now, but there is this passage. Yeah, okay.
Bueno, está reafirmando que esa es una de las razones por las cuales ella considera que Hegel no utiliza el concepto de lo a priori, porque tiene esta connotación crítica, digámoslo, en ese sentido. Hay más, there are more questions. I'm sure you're
Yes.
looking at it. No, the comments on the same. Can I give a follow to this problem? Can I continue with this discussion? Yeah, this is one of the one aspect of the general problem I was seeing in your argument, like the problem that was that you were building. I was thinking about what happened to the phenomenology of spirit. You're talking about the science of logic, and you're talking about the Realphilosophy, and you're talking about philosophy of nature, philosophy of spirit. But I also think I somehow missed at least a reference to what Hegel considers to be absolute knowledge in the phenomenology of spirit. And this discussion you just had with Christian remind me what I wanted to ask you. What about this recursive knowledge of the philosophical point of view, the philosophical perspective? I don't think that this is an a posteriori knowledge of a priori standpoint. But it's interesting to discuss it in this, at least in an instrumental way, to see what nature would be this sui generis kind of knowledge that you referred to. So it's not a priori because it's not a posteriori, but it's a sui generis kind of knowledge. And this is a claim, one of the famous claims in the phenomenology of spirit, right? Philosophy is a very special kind of knowledge, which is not compared to scientific knowledge, but it's even superior in a way to scientific knowledge. So what nature is this knowledge that gets to know itself after its own development, if it's not a priori? And what is the content of this sui generis nature of philosophical knowledge? Resumo brevemente la pregunta, que tiene que ver con el comentario pregunta que se acaba de formular en relación al carácter a posteriori del conocimiento a priori de la filosofía. Ya es claro que Karen no está de acuerdo con esa lectura, pero yo preguntaba sobre el carácter recursivo del conocimiento filosófico, puesto que de las ideas que Karen propone en su artículo es precisamente que la filosofía, si bien no es un conocimiento a priori, sí es un conocimiento sui generis. Entonces quería preguntarle por la naturaleza y por el contenido de esta apelación sui generis. ¿Qué significa que sea sui generis? Sí, como se afirma en la fenomenología del espíritu, hay una especie de recursividad en el autoconocimiento del conocimiento absoluto.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I mean, thinking about the phenomenology, it's always gets a little bit tricky, because there you also have like the whole discussion about in which sense does the logic presuppose a phenomenology or not, and but just sticking to what you said about philosophical knowledge there, then I would say in this sense, I think we could also say there, it is in the end, what the knowledge that we achieve in the phenomenology is conceptual knowledge, and the knowledge that this conceptual knowledge structures reality. But I would say, but they are also there exactly, I would say, not in the sense of a priori, a posteriori. If we take, for example, seriously how we took it at the beginning, that it's not about laying bare all the conditions and then now the conditions are met, so this is correct knowledge. No, but by going through and making errors and all this, and then achieving this one. So in this sense, it would be different. Yeah, I mean, in this sense, I haven't thought about, so to say, about a replacement of a priori, a posteriori. I don't know if I have to replace it, maybe find another vocabulary, because then you're running the danger or the risk of developing new dualisms. So if you replace a dualism with another one, then maybe it's not, yeah. That's why I would just say conceptual knowledge, but also, of course, which also implies the claim that conceptual knowledge structures reality. So that concepts are like, we don't have to prove that concepts in this sense structure reality. They do it, and we start from there, and then we see how we can achieve knowledge. Yeah.
May I ask you something before getting back to Javier's question? Yeah, you mentioned maybe we don't have to find a substitute for this dualism a posteriori, a priori, because that would meant the most dangerous thing of reproducing a dualistic thinking. And I agree. But how about this recursive structure we were talking about? I have the impression that in your paper there are at least two definitions of philosophical knowledge, and these two definitions have to do with what I assume to be a recursive nature of knowledge in Hegel's philosophy. As you just mentioned, you said that philosophy is the ordering of. I'm not sure I'm going to repeat appropriately what you just said, but you said something like concepts are ordering reality. Concepts have to do with reality. That's one statement. It's more complicated, and maybe you can refine it, because I cannot reproduce exactly what you just said. And on the other hand, you also talked, this is in your talk, you also talked about systematicity.
Yes.
Both aspects are related, but are not the same, right? So on the one hand, you have what logic does, and on the other, you have what the system does, and both are accurate candidates to to be recognized as philosophical knowledge. Both are philosophical knowledge, but they are on different levels, I would say. So talking about recursivity and the nature of philosophical knowledge, even in Hegel's Science of Logic or in Hegel's Encyclopedia, wouldn't you think that it is that a sort of distinction is needed, not to reproduce dualism, but to point out at least two aspects or two levels of philosophical sui generis knowledge? I'm going to translate again, sorry.
Yeah.
La pregunta que le acabo de hacer a Karen tiene que ver con reconocer que no queremos reproducir el dualismo a posteriori a priori, pero que quizás sería necesario hablar o distinguir al menos dos niveles del conocimiento sui generis, del conocimiento filosófico que es sui generis, de acuerdo con Karen, teniendo en cuenta que en su propio texto, Karen hace la distinción entre un ordenamiento conceptual de la realidad y el pensamiento sistemático. Y la idea es que no son exactamente los mismos, aunque están relacionados. Mi pregunta era si, teniendo en cuenta esta doble naturaleza del conocimiento filosófico, no sería necesario hablar o tener a la mano al menos dos conceptos que se refirieran a la naturaleza sui generis del conocimiento filosófico, sin caer en el dualismo a priori a posteriori.
Okay, thanks. So this is also a good question, like how the two candidates that I identified in order to describe philosophical knowledge sui generis, systematicity, and reflexivity relate to each other. And I would say, yeah, so now, as I have said, I don't want to reinstall another dualism. I'm forced to say it's not a dualism. And so, in a way, I am tempted to say that they are like two moments implying each other. Because but then I would have to say more than I have said in my talk. So I would have to spell out all what comes along with systematicity, because you have there also this completeness stuff and so on. And if, for example, so that like you need a complete system, it must, like the beginning must prove the end must prove the beginning and so on. So in this sense, you have like the circle again, and we must make sure that everything, that is complete, that we grasp everything in there. So, and there I would say then, in this sense, reflexivity must be part of it, a moment of it, because if we are about to capture the conceptual structure of reality, then we can't leave out ourselves as thinking subjects, because we are ourselves in the structure of reality. So the whole system needs to incorporate this. And that's what I meant with, that's the point I made about, in the logic, you have the idea of cognition. So the structure of cognition is considered itself in the logic, even though the logic is also a philosophical process. And also at the end of the system, you have philosophical knowledge, which is also considered in the whole system and is one part of the whole system, the ending part, so to say. So in this sense, this moment of reflexivity must be incorporated in the moment of systematicity. On the other hand, I think you can only achieve the moment of systematicity if you already have some kind of reflexive standpoint, because it's about the reflection of concepts. So the claim I would like to push forward would be they're both co-constitutive in a way. So there is no dualism in this sense. Yeah, they imply each other. Yeah.
La respuesta en resumida es que no hay un dualismo. Karen tiene muy claro que no quiere reproducir planteamientos dualistas. lo que sugiere es que deberíamos pensar tanto el pensamiento reflexivo, es decir, la organización conceptual de la realidad, como el pensamiento sistemático, como dos elementos que se corresponden mutuamente o que se necesitan mutuamente. Hay una mutua referencialidad de ambos momentos del saber filosófico. Voy a insistir en la pregunta que Javier había planteado. Tal vez, Javier, si quieres, la puedes reformular. La voy a repetir, pero igual enriquecerla para ver si queda más clara. I'm going to read again Javier's question. And maybe ask him if he can develop a little bit more his question. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. Perhaps a good point of comparison would be the notion of immediacy versus the notion of a priori. As in, immediacy is not necessarily understood a priori. Would you like to comment on it?
Yes, I can. I comment first, and then maybe he's already writing, which would be nice.
About the relation between immediacy and a priori.
Yeah, I think this is also a really good question. A good question I haven't thought about so far, the relation between immediacy and the a priori, and how I understand the spirit of the question, so to say, is that if we start with something that is given immediately, we think it over, in my terms, or in Hegel terms, like philosophizing, we think it over, and then we end up with another concept. So to say, in the logic you have being, then we think it over, end up with nothing. And this would, in a way, so this is that's how I understand the question or the comment. This would, in a way, indicate that this can't be an a priori endeavor. Is this the comment?
Javier, no sé si eso es claro para ti. La pregunta se te devuelve para saber si te está entendiendo bien. ¿Te refieres a la manera en la que los conceptos, por ejemplo, el ejemplo que estaba poniendo de la ciencia de la lógica, se transforman y cómo después de darle una pensada, Nachdenken al que se refiere, los conceptos se transforman? Es una pregunta para ti, Javier. I don't know if we should wait or go on. Another question.
Yeah, but now I was thinking about pure being as sheer immediacy.
Would you like to comment on that? And then I'll read the question.
And then yes, okay, yeah. So let me read it. To think in pure being is possible as reflection.
Oh, you're reading what they just wrote.
No, what
Javier wrote.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting I need to think about that. It's interesting to try to rephrase or to relate the a priori to a posteriori with the immediate mediated thing. So because the spirit of my talk was more to say, you have this immediate thing and mediation thing in the logic. There's something immediate that gets mediated, and then there's another concept, and so on and so on. And you could still say that the whole logic is a priori, though then in a different sense as Kant, so to say. That's why I worked a lot with the validity distinction, because you could still say, well, you can have this like transcendental reflection about the mediation of concepts, so to say, and this is valid in itself, and this is valid independently of experience, and that's why I put it in such a way. So, and not with the distinction between immediacy and mediation. But maybe one could. So I think it wouldn't work directly in the logic, because if we agree that we can still say they are mediated concepts, immediate concepts in the logic, and this could still be a priori, then it wouldn't work. But if we think maybe about logic and realphilosophy as a relation of mediacy and immediacy, then maybe it would be different. I think about that. If this would help to maybe also rephrase or to make another claim about why it can't be a priori. I think about it. Thank you.
Ok, Karen agregó un comentario al agregado que Javier hizo. Javier agregó que estaba pensando en la inmediatez del ser puro ser, que aparece en la ciencia de la lógica, y en ese sentido sí se podía pensar en el ser a través, sí, el ser es posible a través de la reflexión, pero el puro ser no tiene el estatus de lo a priori. Y Karen concedió que tiene que darle una pensada a esta cuestión porque no piensa que en la ciencia de la lógica se pueda hacer esta distinción tan claramente, mientras que quizá entre la ciencia de la lógica y la filosofía real es más fácil plantear la cuestión de la inmediatez y la mediatez. I'm going to read the last comment.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't see it anymore. Oh, yeah, here it is. So, thanks for the beautiful talk. I have two questions. Both return to some points of the discussion. The first one is about the thesis that speculative concepts must be proven in reality. Also in Kant, categories only achieve objective validity in experience. What would be the specific difference between the objective validation of a priori category and the speculative approval of concepts in experience? Traduzco. The second one, very briefly, in transcendental dialectics, reason is defined as the art of systems. And then in the doctrine of the method, the notion of history of pure reason is thematized. How to differentiate between the historical and the systematical in Kant and Hegel. Sorry for the abstract formulation, and thanks again. I'm going to translate briefly or quickly. Gracias por la bella conversación. Tengo dos preguntas. Ambas se refieren a temas pasados de la discusión. La primera pregunta tiene que ver con la tesis de los conceptos especulativos, de si los conceptos especulativos pueden ser probados en la realidad. En Kant, las categorías solo adquieren validez objetiva en la experiencia. Eso significaría, ¿cuál sería, la diferencia específica entre la validez objetiva de las categorías a priori y la aprobación especulativa de los conceptos en la experiencia? Y la segunda pregunta tiene que ver con lo que Kant afirma en la dialéctica trascendental. Ahí la razón es definida como el arte de los sistemas. Y Después, en la doctrina del método, la noción de historia de la razón pura es caracterizada. ¿Cómo diferenciar entre lo histórico y lo sistemático en Kant y en Hegel? Siento lo abstracto de la formulación. Gracias. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks a lot for the 2 questions. They're great. Because both of them, in a way, push me in the direction to say, well, but this sounds really Kantian. Like, and that's right. Like, takes the first question. If we say that concepts must be proven in reality, then this sounds really Kantian, because what Kant bonds, well, one could say, well, the categories too must be proven in reality, and that's why we need the transcendental deduction. So thanks. I mean, yeah, so there I would have to, it's right that this sounds Kantian in this sense, but so first of all, again, like with respect to both questions, my claim is not that that Hegel does not adopt anything from Kant. I only think it's not the a priori posteriori distinction. And maybe it's more, I don't want to say I only think, but like the focus of my talk was, it's not the a priori posteriori distinction, but it doesn't mean that that Hegel adopts other things. But so, because I say this now, I first reply to the second question and then to the first. Because the second, art of systems, I think what Hegel really adopts is the account of systematicity and the idea of systematicity, of philosophy as a system, but it must be spelled out in a different way as it was in Kant. For example, I think he criticizes that Kant only, sets up the table of categories, but doesn't actually show how they relate to each other. Kant writes they do relate, but just by showing this, it's not obvious. So, and in this sense, I think, yes, Hegel takes the point of systematicity, but proceeds with this point or spells it out in a different way than Kant would. This is one point. And the other point with history of reason, yes. I would say in a way it's the same point for Kant. I don't want to say that history of reason is not important for Kant. I think it is too, but I don't see how history of reason could play any role when it comes to the categories, because they are supposed to be a priori, and that means not historical. And there I would say, one could say now, Hegel takes the notion history of reason, on my reading, more seriously actually than Kant does. So yeah, so this is maybe first the first question, and I answer the second question. I answer the first question afterwards, right? Yeah.
Okay. Karen hace la precisión de que hay algunas cuestiones que no desarrolló en su charla, en su texto, cosas que no dijo y que habría que, porque no era el punto de su argumento, pero concede que es importante para Hegel la manera en la que Kant desarrolla el concepto de sistematicidad. En eso estaría de acuerdo, pero no estaría de acuerdo en la importancia o el efecto de la idea de historia de la razón pura que Kant propone en la crítica de la razón pura, porque para Kant, porque en Kant no es obvio que teniendo la razón historia o siendo la razón histórica pueda afirmarse que las categorías también lo son, ¿no? Y eso es algo que lo diferencia o que marca una diferencia importante con la manera en la que Hegel comprende las categorías como históricas. Bueno, en esto tengo una pregunta que tengo que hacerle a Karen. Karen, sorry, just a quick question concerning your answer. Are you implying then that the difference between Hegel and Kant regarding the history of reason would be that Kant is not assuming, it's not giving historicity to categories while Hegel does. Would that be the general meaning of the difference?
This would be one meaning. I think there are different ones. This is just the most placative one, so to say. And that's why I thought I'd take this one first. Yeah. But I would say there are more.
Sí, es parte de su argumento, la idea de que no hay historicidad en las categorías, mientras que en Hegel sí. Hay más razones por las cuales esta historicidad es distinta, pero es la primera que da. Okay.
And and thanks for the first question, because there now it looks like if Hegel also thinks that we need to prove the concepts of the logic in reality, it sounds like the objective validity thing in Kant, that we need to prove the categories, the objective validity of categories in experience through transcendental arguments. And again, there I would say, even they're pretty close there, like the formulation sounds close with proving the concepts. I would say in Hegel, it's not via transcendental deduction, not at all, because the transcendental deduction presupposes the strict dualism between concepts and sensible manifold. And as I understand Hegel there, because the proving stuff was a quote from the end of the whole system. So I understand it actually in another way, saying that, well, we have picked up, you have the logic, you have then the philosophy of nature, philosophy of spirit. So we have picked up, so to say, the concept, the scientific results of Hegel's time there, Hegel has picked it up, the results of his time in his Realphilosophie. Hegel has thought through the conceptual character of these results, and then also he has thought through the conceptual character of the concepts, so to say, in the logic. So this would be I understand it a little bit as some kind of abstraction, but at the same time, thinking this through, these are at the same time the structures that already structure reality. These are already the concepts that structure reality. And I understand it then in a more dynamic way. Once we're through the whole thing, we can say, yes, this is this is the way of putting his own time or one's own time in thoughts, or Hegel's time. But it doesn't mean that reality doesn't develop anymore, so to say, and with it also the concepts. So I understand in a way that we have go through the whole process again. And rethink it again and again and again, so to say. And that's what I mean with proven. So what I rather want to say there is with the proven stuff shall mean that once we have the whole system, it doesn't mean that it's stable as it is and totally as it is in itself. But because if the content of the system is the content of reality, and reality is a dynamical one that changes, then at least this system must be open to changes too. This is rather the way I'm thinking. Yeah.
I'm going to try to translate the complex idea. La respuesta a la primera pregunta, que tiene que ver con la posible relación entre la expresión validez de los conceptos y la aprobación especulativa de los conceptos en Hegel, uno Kant, uno Hegel. Esta relación no es una identificación porque aunque lo parezca, porque para Hegel la realidad y los conceptos no están disociados, y el pensamiento sistemático implica una relación constante entre el pensamiento y la realidad. Es decir, que el sistema siempre está abierto. Listo. Okay, I resumed a lot your last answer. Let me see if there's something else. No, and I think unless I receive another indication, I think we can conclude. We've been 2 hours discussing. I don't know if I'm freezed. I don't know if
you're freezed.
Yeah,
I can hear you, but yes, yeah, now, okay. Yeah, you're freezed, but I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, I'm freezed again. Yeah, I was saying that maybe we can conclude your talk and the discussion, unless anyone wants to add something. If not, I would like to. Sorry, I'm going to translate this. Vamos a terminar la conversación del magnífico texto de Karen. A menos que alguien quiera hacer alguna otra pregunta. Bueno, ya llevamos 2 horas. Creo que podemos concluirlo. Karen, I really want to thank you again for this very interesting talk and the problems you are addressing. Bueno, le he agradecido por la presentación, por los problemas que plantea, and for the discussion, of course. Más, bueno, no cambia nada la conexión, lo lamento. Nos estaremos viendo en la próxima edición de las charlas Hegel online. Thank you again, Karen.
Thank you so much for the talk, for the invitation, and for the discussion. I enjoyed a lot and I learned a lot. Thank you.